Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Rule of Law Albania. My name is Albicela, and I'm your host. And my guest speaker today is a current professor of mine here at Arizona State University, Professor Larry Garber. He's teaching U.S. and international elections law here at Arizona State University. But what's worth mentioning is that he has 35 years of expertise, of experience in elections. Professor Garber, thank you for being with me here today.
Pleasure to be here.
So, Professor Garber, just before we jump in, I'll give you a short background of Albania elections in Albania. Actually, we don't have a long tradition on elections. Actually, next year is going to be the anniversary of the first ever held elections in Albania. So the first elections were held in 1921. And then up to 1943, let's say we had democratic elections, like for the time. Back then, they were considered as democratic. There were several parties, several people running for elections. And then starting from 1945 to 1990, we were a communist country, communist regime. We had elections, but everything was fictitious, of course. There was only the Communist Party. They had no opponents. So that's how it worked. And then we have the first democratic elections again in 1991. And since then, elections have run every 4 years, like they usually do across the planet. But of course, they were not as democratic as we would like them to be. The reports of the OSCE and other international bodies haven't been so good. Corruption, everything, vote frauding, etc. So we still have a lot of issues with regard to elections. The other thing is that in only 30 years post-communism, we have changed the electoral code 8 times, which is a lot. So every party, whenever they won the elections, they came to power, they changed the electoral code, or they changed the administrative division of the country. And that's the current government, that's what they did. First of all, in 2015, they changed the administrative division code. So it's a gerrymandering practice that they did. Basically, they did gerrymandering. And now they changed the electoral code. We talked about them previously together. So the changes, there are 3 main changes. They basically, let's say, prohibited, maybe not prohibited per se, but they banned pre-election coalitions. They lowered the threshold to enter the parliament from 3%, they made it 1%. And they also changed the list. So first I would like to start, let's start with the threshold. So isn't it weird that a government unilaterally changes the electoral code and lowers the threshold? Practice around the globe indicates that usually they tend to higher the threshold. So what is this lowering the threshold? What does it mean in terms of international practice with regard to election law?
The first thing that I'd say is that every country that adopts a new constitution obviously goes through a process where it reflects on what it just did, and so there's often pressures to make changes one way or another in the constitution or in the election law. Sometimes they're designed to correct mistakes that were made drafting the constitution or the election law. A good example that I like to use is the United States, where we adopted an election law in our constitution for the president, and after the first 2 elections realized that it was seriously flawed because the people who drafted it didn't realize what they were doing, in effect. And so within 12 years, we had our first election-related constitutional amendment to change the system for electing the president. It wasn't a major change, but it was a significant change. So, so the number of changes, as you described, in Albania, it seems excessive to have 8 changes in 30 years. But some of them may have been due to, what I will call mistakes, and some of them may have been due to, the reality of political party domination, trying to get, an electoral advantage for one side or another. Specifically related to the threshold, you're absolutely right. The trend has been to raise the threshold to prevent small parties from, which don't have much support around the country, from entering the parliament. and so to avoid, having extremists or, as I said, parties that don't have much broad support. Um, is it anti-democratic? No. I mean, you can make an argument on democracy grounds that every voice should have uh, a say in parliament, and so bringing down the threshold is more democratic than increasing the threshold. But again, the tradition or not the experience over the last several decades has been in favor of raising thresholds. Um, the example of a country that I would use that had a 1% threshold and over time decided to raise it is Israel, which has a 120 person parliament. And from its inception until about the 1990s, had a 1% threshold, which meant that extreme parties or even parties that were one person party where the person wanted to get into parliament to avoid being extradited, to claim immunity from extradition, was allowed and happened. And so eventually they've raised the threshold from 1% to 2.5 to 3%. And it's had the result of either eliminating extremist parties that run by themselves that don't meet the threshold, uh, and then the votes are wasted in effect, or forcing these parties to enter coalitions with other small parties so that they can, get above the threshold. And again, just to use that as an example, to use the same case, Israel. So there were the threshold was raised, and the intent, many believe, was to eliminate the Arab minority parties from receiving representation in the parliament, because none of them, there were several of them, and none of them would receive the requisite amount to cross the threshold. What it did was it forced these parties to run together as a coalition, and it turned out that by running together they became the third largest party in the parliament. And then when the two largest parties formed a coalition, they became the second largest party in the parliament. So they're at this point, main opposition. So in that case, it had, what we would call unintended consequences. But like I said, the general trend has been to raise the threshold around the globe.
But in the case of Albania, it looks like the government is doing this to steal votes from the opposition. So they hope that people will run on their own, especially people that have left the ranks of the opposition, because there are a couple of former MPs of the Democratic Party, which is now in the opposition. They have left the party because they don't like the leader of the current party. So they now have a higher chance to get elected and to take a seat in the parliament. But knowing them, they would take votes from the opposition, from the Democratic Party, which means they would steal votes from the Democratic Party. They will take the seat, and then it would be easier for the government to, let's say, manipulate these individuals within the parliament. So I believe that's the main reason that the government has done this move for.
You may be right. I don't know enough about the intricacies of Albanian politics at this point, despite your trying to educate me. But again, I mean, one has to draw a distinction between, what's clearly undemocratic, illegal under various human rights conventions and the like, and what simply is, politics played out on on the national scene. And so, that may be a perfectly, valid, credible explanation of why the government did it, and it still might be, perfectly legitimate for them to have taken that, not, legal for them to have taken that step. So, the response has to be, that the opposition parties have to, one, mobilize their supporters to go out and vote. They have to be able to ensure that they can offer the small parties something that they want in terms of coalition formation. And then if they, believe that this is sincerely a ploy, they obviously can change the election law when they come to power.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Which would be one more change of the election law, which isn't healthy, but again is part of the process.
Yeah. And then the second change they made is in terms of the coalitions. So let's say they banned pre-elections coalitions. So if two parties want to run together, they can't run separately. They have to submit a list that includes all the candidates from both parties, but people can vote only for the coalition, not the respective parties. I know this is not undemocratic, this move, but still it would make coalitions pretty hard because, of course, the parties have also individualistic aims. Besides overthrowing the government, they also want as many seats as possible on their own without the other party coalition.
Right.
So this is another move that the government is trying not to allow, let's say, parties to run separately, but at the same time as a coalition.
To be honest, this I think really does play into the intricacies of Albanian politics. There's generally a divide between systems that encourage pre-election formation of coalitions and those that encourage post-election formation of coalitions. So, for example, in the United States, we encourage, we have a two-party system, and so basically there's the emphasis on, getting everyone to form a coalition before the election. So you have in the Democratic Party, the different competing strands from, Bernie Sanders to Joe Biden to, Pete Buttigieg, whatever, and they all compete, and then they form a coalition in effect before the election based on the outcome of the primaries. In other places, you have different parties competing, for seats, and then based on the outcome, they form a coalition. There's no right or wrong answer, to which is better system. It often depends on the particular country. But the idea that you're either encouraging or discouraging pre-election coalition formation doesn't seem to be a existential issue. It seems to be, the parties, or in this case, the governing party, choosing what it thinks will help it the most and, impact negatively on the opposition the most. But again, to me, there's a difference between, what's, fair and love in politics and what, is clearly, crosses a threshold of illegality or unconstitutionality.
And the last change they made is the elections list. So the opposition requested open list, 100% open list, so that people could choose the candidate they liked from the list. And what the government did is they divided the list into two parts. So in the first part of the list, they rank the candidates they want, but it's a closed ranking. So however the party ranks them, that's how the seats are going to be distributed. And then we have the second part of the list, which people can give liking votes for them. So people can vote for the party. And then if they want to exercise their right to like one of the candidates, they can. But at the end, the votes of the party are firstly distributed to the first part of the list. So it's the people in the first part of the list that take the seats first. And then if there are other votes, or the persons in the second part of the list have more liking votes than the last person who won a seat in the first part of the list, then they can replace that person. But still, it's really difficult to break the ranks of the party list, of the party ranking. Yeah. So again, this is a matter of politics. Again, I know, but I want your opinion, what you think about this.
Well, again, many countries that use PR list systems have closed lists and basically rely on the party and the internal structures, which are often, based on primaries or other forms to create the list. I mean, so that's not unusual. Some systems create exceptions where the party leader can push someone even over the, democratic choices of the people. Here, it seems to me, as an outsider looking at this objectively without understanding all the nuances of Albanian politics, the change that has been made addresses in a minor way the concerns, of the opposition for allowing some freedom of choice of the voter to like a particular candidate. But in practice, will probably have limited effect because you have to have, a lot of people liking lots of candidates for it to actually change, the rankings that the party has come up with. But, the typical practice is for the party to come up with, the list based on whatever rules the party has. And usually it's not left, to the actual election to restructure the entire list. So again, it might be important from an Albanian political perspective to have completely open lists. But again, that's going to require, I would guess, the opposition to do very well in these elections or in a subsequent election and to change the election law, in that manner rather than counting on the government to do so.
The thing is that why we want it so much is because the current government in 2013, they included in their list people that apparently had criminal records and nobody knew because they didn't declare them. And that's what, let's say, we were scared of. We want at least to, let's say, investigate ourselves prior that we vote, investigate every candidate possible, and then pick out the one that we prefer the most.
But again, just using your hypothetical, Albi, if you didn't know about it, you wouldn't be able to make an informed choice anyway. And if you did know about it beforehand, then the the people should be prescribed from being included on the list, in any event. So it seems to me the issue is more, what do people know? Are they given the requisite information before the election, which is critical? But in your case, even if you had a ranked list and you didn't know who the criminals were, why would you pick or not pick particular candidates? So again, I mean, I think it's from a transparency perspective, the important part is that the information about the candidates should be released, whether it's tax returns. You may have heard there's a big issue about that in the United States these days, or other.
I'm sure Albanians would forgive that. We're talking about criminal records like drug trafficking, prostitution, etc.
Right, but I'm just saying is even in the United States, the tradition was to have your tax returns released before the election, but there was no law requiring it. And many people say that the consequences, we know less about the candidate running for president who has not released his tax returns in terms of who he might owe favors to or who he might owe money to, and so the argument has been made that it's critically important to do so, but it has to be enshrined in an election in a law in order to obligate the person to do so. And I think the same thing is true, in the context of what you're talking about. There has to be some law that says candidates are required to, release these types of information so that voters can better understand their character. And, and again, what you're really getting at is that in Albania, the judicial authorities should have to review and clear people before they're allowed to run.
Now they're supposed to, but back then they see the candidates lied. The judiciary didn't investigate properly on it. So
I'm saying, but those are broader governance faults that aren't going to be, rectified by simply, giving people the ability to move people up and down the list.
I understand. And then another big issue in Albania is the voting of the diaspora that has been discussed a lot lately. So
Yeah.
unlike many other countries, Albania, the situation of Albania is really complicated because right now in Albania we have 2.8 million people living there, and outside we have at least 1.5 to 1.6 million citizens, not only diaspora, but citizens who are eligible to vote if, of course, they are 18 or more. And the thing is that there are many that are requiring, and me myself, I would prefer to allow Albanians to vote from the country they are living in. And apparently the government is saying that they're not saying that we don't want this, but they are not doing nothing about it. In the constitution, everyone is eligible to vote, every Albanian citizen. The only thing is that if I want to vote the next elections, I can from the United States, so I have to go back to Albania and cast my ballot. But what do you think? Would it be like, for example, Americans can vote from every corner of the world they're in?
Right.
And Albanians, again, and it's a large number, and it would affect the political system a lot. So why shouldn't we vote from where we are?
Well, the same reason you just raised can be made the opposite argument that given the numbers, I mean, the numbers of the United States of people who live abroad, while significant, is not more than 1% of the total population. So rarely will affect the actual outcome of the election. And the argument is made that the electorate should be the people who physically live in the particular place where they're voting, and therefore they should have to cast their ballots physically in those places. And many countries, indeed many states in the United States, require people to be living in the place where they live and to physically go and cast their ballots in those places. And having, as you said, 1.4 million eligible Albanians out of a population of 2.8 million, means that the people, I mean, you can imagine, theoretically at least, that the 1.4 million Albanians can form the Albanian Diaspora Party, get 50% of the votes, and you'd have a prime minister sitting in Washington, responsible for governing a country. So there, there isn't a right or wrong answer here, but I can certainly understand the concerns of Albanians living in Albania from wanting to allow a diaspora party, or the diaspora as a whole, to have undue influence over decisions that will directly impact
there might be
Albanian
mechanisms which would limit the power of the diaspora. For example, it would be really easy to prescribe in the constitution that the members of the parliament which represent the diaspora, let's say, they don't have the right to submit a motion to remove the government. That would be a mechanism.
But then you're distinguishing amongst members of parliament. So some members of parliament have certain rights, other members of parliament have less rights, which raises its own issues. I mean, I could see a different solution, which I know some countries have used, which is to give the diaspora a certain number of seats in parliament. So the diaspora would elect, let's say, I mean, it's a big diaspora, so let's say even in this case, it would elect 10% of the parliament. So 10% of 140 would be 14 seats that would be elected by the 1.4 million Albanians. So it's not, one person, one vote, but it is giving the diaspora representation in the Albanian parliament, but still under, so the diaspora by itself can nowhere control the who runs the government there. So that would be, I think, if I were involved in designing the Albanian process, that's probably be where I would put my energy. And again, I'm just making up 10%. It could be 5%. It could be 12%.
Well, actually, that's a practice.
That,
For example, in Croatia, Croatia gives a maximum of 7 seats,
right.
and then there's Italy 12, and then there's France again that has 12 seats
Yeah.
for the diaspora. So yeah,
So,
there's
so
practice
that
on
to
that.
me is more both common but also more practical. I cannot see honestly where a country would allow, you know, potentially, 30-40% of its parliamentarians to be elected by a party that was based outside the country.
Well, not a party basically, but the people could still be eligible to vote. Also, existing parties in Albania, because they still do. I'm not saying
No,
that.
I understand that, but I'm just saying, imagine
Yeah,
the extreme consequences. You say, okay, we don't like any of the parties, or there's, a small party in Albania, that has traditionally gotten 1-2% of the vote.
and they
And
decide to
now the
vote for that.
diaspora says, okay, let's all vote for that party. And all of a sudden they go from 1 or 2 seats to,
Yeah,
30-40 seats based on, the diaspora vote. It shifts the dynamics considerably. And there are different perspectives. I mean, you're living in the United States, have a certain set of interests. You may think those are, relevant to Albanians' national interests, but clearly the people who are living in the country are directly affected by taxes, services, et cetera, et cetera.
I understand. And then one last point here, which is related also to the diaspora, is the electronic vote. For example, the opposition has come up with this idea that it would be good if the diaspora could vote electronically, because basically they don't trust the government to manage the vote of the diaspora.
Right.
I would think
Sure.
rightly so, knowing how the political situation is there. But what do you think about the electronic voting? Me myself, I'm skeptic. I don't like
Yeah.
it personally, but what's your opinion on
So
that?
I think my grandchildren are going to enjoy electronic voting. Um, but to be honest, I don't have any grandchildren yet. So we're at least 18 years away from, universal electronic voting, even in a fairly developed country like the United States. I mean, it took a long time for us to move to mail-in voting in the United States. And we now have 5 states out of 50 that use mail-in voting on a universal basis, but most states don't. And so, this year, because of the pandemic, more states have expanded their mail-in voting. But mail-in voting, there are more controls over it than electronic voting. I think until we can figure out how to deal with some of the issues relating to multiple voting, hacking, etc., we're not ready for it. Now, again, we're going to probably see a couple of small countries that move quickly into electronic voting over the next few years. And they'll provide, lessons, I think, for all of us. And Albania may want to be at the, leaders in that grouping, but my suspicion is that given where Albania is in terms of its progress, in democracy, there are other priorities that are much more important to put in place, to develop before you move to any type of electronic voting.
Professor, lastly, speaking of democracy, it's been 30 years now, post-communism. We have had several elections, local and general elections, and still it doesn't seem that we are democratic enough. We are still in a transition period. We are going, like a couple of weeks ago, you gave me an assignment to read Sherry Berman's book, and it enlightened me, to be honest. Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe. I understood how long it takes for democracy to be established in a country. We see these post-communist countries like Hungary, Poland, that it looked like they would become democratic immediately. It was fantastic. But look at Poland and Hungary now. They have stepped back a lot. Maybe we haven't experienced that yet, but I'm afraid that we will experience the same fate as Hungary and Poland someday. Hopefully not. But what do you think? How can we get out of this turbulent situation, this vicious circle that we're in. It's been 30 years. We are so excited. We want so much to be democratic, but we didn't put any effort after all.
So again, no magic formula. Obviously requires a lot of hard work from a range of individuals, institutions in a country, civil society, the media, the judiciary, the legislature, the political parties all have roles to play in creating the type of democratic culture that is essential for a democracy to survive and thrive. And again, the international community too can play a role in monitoring and calling out some of the problematic, developments in a country, whether it's Poland or Hungary or elsewhere. It's important that people, remain patient. Some of the progress is going to be slow. It's sometimes, not going to be, just the straight trend line up. There may be some hiccups, some caused by, developments like pandemics, some caused by malicious actors. But the important part is to, keep the population, with its eye on the prize. And the prize is to create a democratic society that benefits, the majority of the citizens, on a regular basis. So again, I'm as disappointed. I mean, I was involved in the democratization processes in Hungary in the 1990s, 1990, and elsewhere in East and Central Europe, and I've been disappointed that the progress hasn't been as uniformly straightforward as I would have liked. But I don't believe either Hungary or Poland have yet crossed the threshold where, they're back where they were pre-1990, and I'm happy to see that the international community is placing a spotlight on some of those countries and the negative developments there. And I would hope the same would be true in Albania if the circumstances warranted. So keep the faith, keep mobilizing folks, keep doing programs like this to educate people about the rule of law and aspects of it, and remind people of some of the lessons from Sherry Berman's book.
I'm going to quote something right now, which struck me, and I keep it on my mind now. It's amazing. She said that the road to democracy is not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Yeah.
It basically takes long. It's never ending. For me, the road to marathon to democracy doesn't have a finish. So yeah, we should be patient.
I hope your experience living in the United States and, taking this course contributes to that feeling too, that even in the United States, which has called itself a democracy for 230 years, and has the experience of elections happening every 4 years since 1788, experiences also impediments and obstacles, and where people call into question our democracy. But
exactly.
We persevere, and hopefully you'll watch on November 3rd once again a successful example of a democratic system functioning.
Fingers crossed.
Keeping my fingers crossed too.
Professor, thank you so much for being with me.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate it. See you tomorrow.
All right. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.